In this lecture, we're going to look at JavaScript promises, which are extremely powerful when it comes to dealing with asynchronous code. So what is a promise? A promise is an object that holds the eventual result of an asynchronous operation. So when an asynchronous operation completes, it can either result in a value or an error. A promise basically promises you that it will give you the result of an asynchronous operation. This object can be in one of the three states. Initially, when we create a promise object, it will be in the pending state. At this point, it will kick off some asynchronous operation. When the results are ready, the promise can either be fulfilled or resolved, which basically means the asynchronous operation completed successfully. So here we're going to have a value. Otherwise, if something went wrong during the execution of that asynchronous operation, our promise will be in the rejected state. In this case, we're going to have an error. Now let's see this in action. So back in our project, I'm going to add a new file here called promise.js. This file is going to be our playground to work with promises. Once you master promises, then in the next lecture, we're going to modify the code in index.js and use promises to clean up our asynchronous code. So I'm going to create a promise object here. So P, we set this to a new promise. Now this constructor function takes an argument. This argument is a function with two parameters. So here we pass a function with two parameters, resolve and reject. Okay? So when creating a new promise, we should pass a function with two parameters, resolve and reject. Or we can use the arrow function syntax and make this a little bit simpler. Now at this point, we're going to kick off some async work. We may access a database or call a web service or start a timer, any kind of asynchronous operation. So here we're going to have some async work. Now eventually, when that async work completes, we should either have a value or an error. If there is a value, we want to return this to the consumers of this promise. So somewhere in the code, we're going to consume this promise because this promise object promises us that it's going to give us the result of an asynchronous operation. So we need to send this result to the consumer of this promise. The way we do that is by using this resolve or reject parameters here. Basically, these two parameters are functions. So we can call resolve and pass a value here, let's say 1. So this is the result of our asynchronous operation. And we're using resolve to send this value to the consumers of this promise object. You're going to see that in a second. Now, alternatively, if something goes wrong, we want to return an error to the consumer of that promise. In that case, instead of this resolve function, we're going to call reject. And here we can pass an error message. As a best practice, it's better to pass an error object instead of a simple string like this. So here we pass a new error and put the message here. Okay, now let me temporarily comment this out. Let's imagine our asynchronous operation completes successfully and it will produce 1 as the result. In a real-world application, instead of 1, perhaps we're going to have a user object that we read from database. So that is the result of our asynchronous operation. Now we need to consume this promise. So somewhere else in the code, we get this promise object. And look, here we have two methods on this object. We have catch for catching any errors, and then for getting the result of our asynchronous operation. So here we call then. As an argument here, we pass a function. This function takes result. In this case, result is this one that we are resolving here. So result goes to. Now, what do we want to do with this? Let's say we just want to display it on the console. Console.log result. And here's the result. Now, let's go back in terminal and run node promise.js. So we got 1 as the result. Beautiful. Now in this implementation, there is really no asynchronous work. I'm simply resolving a value immediately. So let's make this a little bit more real life. Here we can call set timeout to kick off some async work, right? So we pass a callback function here and a timeout value, let's say 2 seconds. This is getting similar to our getUser function, right? So now here we have an asynchronous operation. This function, this callback function, will be called after 2 seconds. Here we can resolve a value. So I'm going to move this line here. So after 2 seconds, this asynchronous operation is going to produce the value of 1. Now let's run this application one more time. So back in terminal. Now it's taken 2 seconds and eventually we get 1. Now let's say during the execution of this asynchronous operation, something goes wrong. We want to return an error to the consumer of this promise. So instead of resolve, we're going to use reject. So I'm going to move this line here and remove the comment. Okay, so this promise object, as you saw, has 2 methods, catch and then. So here we have then for the success scenario, and we can also chain catch in case something goes wrong. So here we get an error and we can simply display that error message on the console. So error, each error object that we have in JavaScript, like this error object here, has a message property. So the error message that we pass here will be stored in a property called message. So here I'm going to display error.message. Okay. Now this time, when we run this application, we're going to get an error message on the console because we are rejecting this promise. Okay. So back in the terminal, let's run it one more time. Look, instead of result 1, we got this error message. So let's quickly recap. A promise is an object that holds the eventual result of an asynchronous operation. Initially, it's in the pending state when we create this promise. At this point, it kicks off an asynchronous operation. That operation can complete successfully or it can fail. If it completes successfully, we say the promise is resolved or fulfilled. So the state of this promise changes from pending to resolved, which is also called fulfilled. Now, if the asynchronous operation fails, the state of the promise will go from pending to rejected. So here we use the reject function to return an error to the consumer of this promise. Okay? So this is how we create a promise. And this is how we consume it. We call then to get the result and catch to get the error. Now here's what you need to take away from this lecture. Anywhere you have an asynchronous function that takes a callback, you should modify that function to return a promise. And that's what I'm going to show you in the next lecture.